Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first Adults and Scrutiny panel meeting for this year. So I'd like to welcome you all. I'm going to say I'm Councillor O'Connor, I'm the chair of this committee, and we're just going to do some introduction before we go any further. So I'm going to go to my
I'm Councillor Sheila Peacock, Councillor for South Tottenham.
Guys, I'm one of the new councillors of Tottenham Hale, and I'm a local doctor in Northern Scotland.
Hi, I'm Kathy Brennan, also a new councillor, and I'm councillor for Muswell Hill.
Okay, fine, I'm Scrutiny.
I'm Lucia Desneves. I'm the Cabinet Member for Health, Social Care and Wellbeing, and Council for Living.
Hi, Denise Gundy, Assistant Director of Housing Demand. So my teams have recently joined Adults, Health and Communities.
Hi, I'm Rachel Lissowa. I'm the Director of Integration for Haringey, so I'm employed by the Integrated Care Partnership.
I'm Will Maris, I'm Director of Public Health for Haringey.
Thank you very much, everyone. So just to let you know, we're filming tonight. Well, I'm not sure if we're filming. Is this going?
Yeah, this will be on YouTube afterwards.
Okay. Right, so we're filming. So please note this meeting is being filmed and recorded by the council for any broadcasts. So anyone who's attending the meeting is agreeing to be filmed, recorded, or reported on. Apologies for absence.
Yeah, apologies from Councillor Baylor, Councillor Curran, from Helen Carnier and from Ali Amashali. Also from Vicky Murphy, who sees us in first panels.
Any items for urgent business?
And none sees.
Declarations of interest. I'm going to say that I'm going to declare an interest. So I'm a member of the RCN and my sister's the GP in Tottenham, but I've also noticed from the agenda pack that my sister, Dr. Kate Bees, is actually chairs one of the boards on the papers. So I'm going to declare an interest in that. So I think she's doing aging well. So yes, just that I've got a personal interest in that. So thank you. Any other declarations of interest? Minutes, pages 1 to 10. So these minutes from the previous meeting held. So anything makes you just to let you know that the actions from those minutes, a couple of them are going to be picked up tonight by Councillor. Great, so she's going to give us a verbal update, and there's other updates on the tracker that we're going to be sending around to people, updated trackers, so you can see what the actions, the recommendations are based on that. Otherwise, I'm going to agree the minutes. Councillor Peacock, agreed. Well, I'm looking to you both, but you actually weren't in that meeting. So in terms of reference and membership, agenda item 7, pages 11 to 48. So this is just to let us know, goes through in some detail the terms of reference for membership. Page 43 has got areas of responsibility for the committee. Just to note that for the committee, we have violence against women and girls as part of our remit. But so just for information for committee members, the Open Scrutiny Committee is looking to do a major piece of work on violence against women and girls as part of their committee. So otherwise we would normally take violence against women and girls once during the municipal year. So it's we may or may not be doing that depending on what the OSC parent committee is going to be doing. That's decided on Monday. So any other questions on the terms of reference for membership? And then we've gone to agenda item 8, which is appointment of non-voting co-op team members. I've got Helena Carnier and Ali Ansali. They're both co-op teams, both unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, although Helena did come online for the free meetings. Very impressive, keeping it away at the moment. So I'm just going to propose we vote to accept them onto the committee. Agreed. Okay, thank you. Right, so we're going to go straight on to agenda item 9, which is a face-to-face partnership for health and care. It's pages 53 to 68 of the papers. Going to receive an overview of the development of Harrogate Borough Partnership Health and Care and how it fits in with the integrated care system for North Central London. That's a mouthful. So I'm going to look to colleagues. Obviously, we want plenty of time to utilise. So I don't know how you want to do this because you've got a double agenda block on the agenda items. So I don't know if you want to split it into sections and then give the panel a chance to have the sort of questions as you go through, because otherwise it might be rather lot to leave questions to the end. Too much. So I'm just going to look to all of you sitting in this. I hear Bethany, Will, or Rachel, who's going to be speaking.
Yeah, so I think myself and Rachel are going to do the bulk of the
Okay.
speaking. In terms of displaying the slides, Dominic, do we normally
On the pack.
Okay, so can we just display them on the screen, or is that okay? I think that.
That's just slideshows.
So we
You can't read it.
Yeah, we can't read it here, but we'll.
okay.
we'll
Well,
look at
it'll show us, but
Yeah.
we're all on the same slide. You should have it all in.
It's a spare paper copy. Follow them on.
Just to set the scene. So we've been working together on health and care integration for a number of years. There are some significant developments in terms of the development of the integrated care board and integrated care system at North Central London, and the, I suppose, firming up of the role at borough level of how we can drive health and care integration and improvements in population health. So what we wanted to do today is to kind of start a bit of a process and a journey with Scrutiny, because we're kind of iterating and developing this process on an ongoing basis. So we wanted to give you an overview of some of the context and some of the emerging governance. So that might be a place where we kind of pause after the governance. But we also wanted to talk about the work that we're doing as well, and the kind of outcomes that we're trying to achieve as well. So that might be the second stage or the second part. So Rachel, I wonder if I can hand over to you now and you start going through the pack and we can focus on the governance, take some background.
Yeah, absolutely. So Harrogate Borough Partnership has been in operation for a number of years, and we have been drawing together this range of organisations, which is essentially each of our hospitals, our GP Federation, Bridge as a representative of the VCS, Healthwatch, Public Voice. So we have got we've got experience of working as a partnership. But what's changing and evolving? If we just move into the next slide and the development of the integrated care system are the structures for partnership working. And I'm going to pause on this slide. I'm going to talk through the boxes, even if that seems a little bit painful, but because they are emergent and so they're different from what we might have brought here before. So the integrated care system is our system across North Central London as a whole. So that's Barnet, Enfield, Harrogate, Camden and Islington. And it is very explicitly a partnership across acute trusts, mental health, community trusts, each of the local authorities, voluntary community sector and Healthwatch. So within that integrated care system, we have got some distinct entities. So we've got the NCL Integrated Care Board, or ICB. And I think what's important to understand about the Integrated Care Board is that that is the organisational entity that has taken on the statutory responsibility for allocating the NHS budget and for commissioning services. So what was the CCG has essentially transferred to the Integrated Care Board. And that's chaired by Mike Cook and Francis O'Callaghan as their chief executive. So there is a fairly high level of continuity from what was the CCG, but it is different in some important ways from the CCG, because the CCG was essentially made up of its composite borough CCGs, and the representatives on the CCG board were predominantly primary care representatives from each different borough, and that was its board. The Integrated Care Board that we formed across North Central London has had to revise its membership and its terms of reference quite significantly to recognise that we are an integrated care system. So the clinical representatives on the Integrated Care Board are from all the different parts of our system. So we have representatives from the acute provider trusts. We have a couple of representatives from primary care, but they aren't representing specific boroughs. They're representing the perspective of primary care. And likewise, we have got the Provider Alliance, which is the partnership organisation between all of our different providers, represented on that board. So it does look and feel different to the CCG, and it is recent. So it had its first board meeting on the 4th of July. So it's only just kind of up and running and taking on that statutory responsibility. We also have, or will have, when it's fully formed, the NCL Health and Care Partnership. And so that is not actually fully formed yet. It will be a joint committee with councils and the Integrated Care Board. And that is going to be responsible for the strategic planning to meet public health and social care needs. So that is very much a strategic group, and we can think about it a little bit like the Health and Wellbeing Board is to our borough. That health and care partnership will be to our integrated care system. But underneath that, we've got provider collaboratives, and that is our way of bringing together all of the acute trusts within North Central London, because again, part of this, which we all, I think, will know, is to get greater collaboration between hospitals and more systematic joint working. And so that is for North Central London, being called the UCL Health Alliance, and it accommodates both hospitals and primary care in North Central London. Then we have our place-based partnerships, which is going to be the focus for the rest of this discussion. And we have neighbourhoods. So in national policy and in our practical work, there is an increasing focus on how we mimic that system working, but on a really, really local level. So a level that is below the place of the borough, which for us tends to be, we tend to think about, you know, Central Haringey, North Tottenham, South Tottenham, and West Haringey. So I'm going to pause there because I think that there's quite a lot of information.
I think there might be. So I'm going to look to my fellow councillors. Are there any questions that you'd like to raise? Councillor Giannis or Councillor Brennan?
Yeah, just a couple of almost quite technical questions. As I say, I'm relatively new to this, so excuse any really obvious questions. So just to check then, so we've got the Haringey Borough Partnership. So am I right in saying that other boroughs will have a similar structure as well, and all of those combined will create the North Central London Health and Care Partnership? Is that right, or totally wrong?
No, I mean it's very broadly right. We totally do. Each borough has its own integrated care partnership or borough partnership. I would say that the integrated care system is sort of more than the sum of those parts, because there's a huge amount within our integrated care system, which is essentially the acute trusts working together in a networked way, which touches only lightly on what we do as borough partnerships. What we're doing is on borough partnerships is much more focused on the wider determinants and health inequalities within our boroughs, where there's lots of things like that are a bit more around things like consolidation of elective pathways.
Just a couple more quick questions, and then I might come back afterwards. In terms of the Integrated Care Board, and the budget. So the budget is fixed centrally, and then it's, do we have any information on that budget going up or down? Is it steady?
Under pressure is, so essentially it's our responsibility as an integrated care board to present a balanced budget to NHS England. And the challenge is that, the challenge and the opportunity is that whereas before that was broken down, that had a kind of commissioning and provider dimension to it. So there was a lot of negotiation between individual trusts and the CCG about where deficits sat. Now, as an integrated care system, we have to balance across the piece. So our finance officer essentially looks across all of our component organisations, each component trusts, and has to present to NHS England a budget that's as close to balance as we can achieve. Integrated care system.
I thought it might be helpful to come in with a political, with a small p, maybe, response to answer this question, which is that I think you're playing around in the right territory around some of the challenges, which is that locally we have some things that decisions that we want to make and priorities, which might be similar to many of our other boroughs, but might not be based on the need of our own community. But you're quite right, at that top level, the budget will be set, and also certain decisions are taken. And this is all quite new, and that's the other thing to say is that these slides, this is really new, although the integrated care system, is live. These things are still, I think I saw the slides for the first time yesterday. It's brand new, so there's a lot of question about that decision-making process, and you will have seen a lot around questions about who sits on that board at that board level and the bit in between. And I think that's the big question, and how we balance our priorities. And for me, as a local politician, I'm thinking about how we make the balance between early help and prevention and some of the things we know we need to do. Plus, but of course, there'll be in play in this whole piece will be also the waiting lists and acutes that you will know all about. I know. So I think your questions are really in a good place, because you're asking the questions that we are asking, that feel uncomfortable or perhaps worrying, I suppose.
Rachel, very quick question. I noticed you said that I came onto the meeting on the 4th of July, so I sat through that meeting. So that was really interesting. I wasn't quite sure who other than Like Francis is actually on that. Is it possible to get the list of who's actually on that scrutiny committee? I'm also not expecting you to remember the names. And the other question, and I did note you were saying about the North Central London Health and Care Partnership. From my understanding, I think that was the only board that hadn't actually yet been fully formed, wasn't it, on the 4th of July? It's just really a question around resident representatives on these boards. I wasn't clear if there's going to be any on either of the two top boards, and it would just be helpful. I don't know if you know if there are going to be any of them from the voluntary sector or council, or who I suppose for us, patient representatives, council and voluntary sector organisations. So if you know on those first two, the ICB board and the care partnership, health and care partnership board.
Yeah. So the membership of the integrated care board, I know, and that has been set because we've had to have a constitution. That has non-exec members, and I mean, I do have in front of me, but I don't think it's necessarily very helpful to kind of run through the membership. That has one local authority partner member, and it doesn't have a patient representative. However, I think the diagrammatically, the way that the governance for the integrated care system looks is that you've got the integrated care board, then you've got the integrated care partnership, which is what I was talking about before, which hasn't been properly sort of formed and constituted yet, so it doesn't yet have a fixed membership. The precursor to it is the existing, it's called the Partnership Council. I'd need to just let me double check. And that involves each council leader, council chief exec, and does have VCS representation on it. And that's the precursor, and the exact membership of what will be the integrated care partnership hasn't yet been defined. Sitting alongside that is a community partnership forum, and that's the prime forum where there are VCS and patient representatives, and the job of that group is to make sure that engagement runs through the work of the integrated care system. So at the moment, the Haringey members on that are Healthwatch and Helena Kanye, with our resident representative.
Okay, that's all I had. There's questions on that first slide. Thank you.
Good quick one.
Yes.
There's another quick one on the slide before this. So obviously the Haringey Borough Partnership has existed before all of this, to say for a few years. Do you, sort of two-pronged question, do you envisage the sort of the agency of the HBP being increased or decreased in the new structure? And if you were to, and secondly, in terms of the component of the HBP, you know, see there's some, as you say, non-sort of NHS organisations. So what's the process for any given organisation to get onto that forum going forward as well? Sort of, that's not quite clear in my head. Do they have a specific locally? So, for example, I'm just coming up with something thin air. Doctors of the World, for example, do lots on migrant healthcare. They will be involved locally in some way. As may well know more about that than I. You know, would a sort of national organisation with local roots sort of being involved? What's the process of being in this?
It's a very interesting. So I would say that there is every possibility that anyone with a local presence is involved in the work of Haringey Borough Partnership. I think our VCS groups are represented on the board at the moment via Bridge, and that. So if we were to change that from having a strategic partner to having individual organisations represented on the board, we'd have to do that. But we have. There's never been a proposal to do that. We'd have to do it quite carefully because there are so many different organisations. So at the moment, there isn't a particular plan to do that. But that's not to say that the multiplicity of VCS organisations shouldn't be involved. So I go relatively regularly to the network that Jeffrey coordinates to talk to them about things that are going on within the borough partnership. And the power question, I think, is a really, really interesting one. And you know, you have put your finger on you know, at a really live issue, which is just how do we get the most how do we get the balance of power and responsibility and accountability right between working as a system and working as a borough? And we say right, I mean right in terms of actually making a difference for residents. And it's very much kind of, it's very much evolving. There's been quite a push to use our joint working as an integrated care system to make changes that we haven't been able to make when boroughs have worked individually. So, for example, there's been a big review of community health services with the idea of coming out with a core offer for community health services, which is, you know, it's things, district nursing, tissue viability nursing, huge pain management services, a huge range of different services. And there's been an attempt to look across North Central London at each borough and say how much investment has there been in community services, and actually also what are the outcomes. So are people spending more of their time at home and in good health in the boroughs where there's been more investment in community services, and come up with a core offer that every borough should be able to meet. And that is not without its complexity, but is also an opportunity for boroughs like Haringey that have historically had lower investment, subjectively have just had lower investment in community services. So be part of an integrated care system allows you to have that comparator, and actually to have those difficult conversations about how we invest as a system and get some greater equality. However, there are loads of things that just have to be, where the power really does need to sit within the borough and the responsibility, because otherwise you lose the connection with your residents and you don't necessarily have the right priorities. So for that, we need accountability, responsibility, delivery at borough level.
Thank you. Well, each slide is going to be as detailed as thank you.
In fact, I think I won't dwell on this slide because it's setting out the purposes of an integrated care system, which I think we covered.
Yeah.
And I won't particularly dwell on the next slide about the ideas behind system working, except to say that everybody is talking a lot about population health approaches, and that's what Will is going to talk a bit more about as we go on. But I'm not going to dwell on that. I'm going to go straight on to the expectations of place. So what this slide sets out are some of the expectations that were set out in the integration white paper, which is really what we've had that talks from a sort of national policy level about expectations of place. And what it says is that by spring 2023, all places should have a leadership and governance model and should have a single point of accountability across health and social care. So it's envisaged as being a person who has accountability for the delivery of for production really of a shared plan, and who takes responsibility for trying to make sure that we're achieving the outcomes that are set out within that plan for our borough or our place, working together with local partners. The white paper also sets some expectations that the plan is underpinned by pooled or aligned resources, including a significant proportion of services and spend held by the place-based arrangement, but gives quite a long lead time for that. So one of the other points that's important to make is that the white paper came out, it was very permissive, which is clearly a different way of saying it was fairly high level and left a lot for local determination, and that we've not received the guidance. So we are expecting guidance on the detail that sits behind that white paper. It's promised for summer, but obviously there's a lot of political upheaval at the moment. So until we receive the guidance, we're proceeding as though this is what we need to achieve. But there is the possibility that there's a slightly different emphasis when the guidance comes out. So, for example, there is a possibility that you might have a bit more accountability sitting with a board rather than necessarily with an accountable individual. So, yes.
Rachel, sorry, can I ask, is that who would be that accountable person if it's kept in this? Because obviously Mike Cook is the top, but you're obviously not going to have them accountable for all of this. So who, what sort of level, and would you then need to appoint someone specifically in to sort of work between both the council and town?
So,
yeah.
So
obviously, we have not placed no, there's a, but the considerations are looking at the chair. Partnership. As Rachel has said, and that's what some of the places, what Rachel said is that we haven't actually had those conversations yet. What we are trying to do is to put together a role profile for what that should look like in terms of single account. Obviously, we have that conversation at our partnership level, get consensus who could best fit that role. So, for example, it could well be a CEO of the community health, it could be the CEO of the council, but it's all kind of that we're looking at. But I think the important point to take away is that this is not someone operating autonomously. We've actually got to bring and coalesce the ambitions of the board at place, like that leadership. So just in terms, and that role will obviously need some support, you know, in order to really work in very different ways to how we've been working. So part of what we're doing is looking to see what that support might look like and how constant support to the role.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, because for me, that's quite a huge, I know you're saying the board's underneath and obviously, but that person who has that accountability in that 5-borough-based partnership, that is a huge ask. So if one person who is the chair of that at the moment.
So this is the place, this is the Haringey
So
place.
it's not going to go for all the 5 boroughs, it literally would just be for your own.
It's just for your
Okay,
own.
I saw the 5-borough-based partnership and I thought they would be oversitting.
The
whole thing.
the other one,
Okay.
which is yet to be developed with the 5 borough. It's unfortunate they've
I
both
know.
called. They've got the
Integrated
same
care
name.
partnerships.
So the 5 borough MCL partnership is
Yes.
also called, you know, ICP.
Right, okay.
We might need to
Might
come
need
up
to
with a
rename
different
that.
terminology,
Yeah.
but there's also that accountability at place, i.e. Haringey Borough,
Right, okay.
that we have already got, you might call it a shadow kind of partnership that's been in existence for some time. We've had the borough partnership seminars, we've got the borough partnership exec.
Yeah.
I think you're familiar with those.
No,
kind of,
thank you. It was just, I was just wondering,
Yeah.
that's a new, okay.
So new,
That's
that's the
fine.
same terminology, unfortunately.
So just moving on to the next slide. I will just mention these ambitions for place because they have come from a process by which each of the different boroughs within North Central London have been doing some joint work, and actually Charlotte was really influential in being the kind of council lead together with Sarah McDonald-Davis, who's the exec director on the Integrated Care Board for partnerships and place. So we've been working together to try to say what's the essence of what we're trying to achieve at borough level. And it's important that it's reducing health inequalities that's at the top through quality and accessibility, tackling the wider determinants of health and well-being, and that the working with residents and co-designing and co-delivering integrated services, often at neighbourhood level, is also really high and a key kind of definition of how we want to work at place level, as is our support for development of integrated frontline teams. So that is one of our key opportunities, is to, as we always have tried to, but structures just haven't necessarily facilitated that joint working across frontline teams, and particularly between different agencies, but also within the same organisations. And modelling collaborative behaviours, building trust, letting go, ceding to others where this is the right thing to do, coming together to solve problems, and importantly, and to your point a little bit about the power, system, borough and provider will be seen as equal and interconnected partnerships, so that we're trying really hard not to kind of disempower one bit of the one level of the system. The next slide, which is very busy, I'm sorry, I needed more subheadings, is just kind of what are going to be the actual functions? What are we actually going to be responsible for doing at borough level? And again, this has come out of joint work across the 5 boroughs. And what we've come out with is a combination of responsibilities for core business, like responsibility for safeguarding, improving quality of services, delivery of transformation work. Some things which are what we need to do because it's what's in the white paper and we would want to do it anyway. So things like publishing a local partnership plan that sets out our core actions and deliverables, and that reflects the needs of our population. Making sure that we've got co-design and co-production at the heart of our system and how we work, and shaping and refining an operating model for place. So making sure that how we do delivery, whether it's for children and young people or for working age adults, that we're setting out operating models where we've got integration, and that we're trying to bring together some of our transformation programs. So that's often quite difficult because what the hospitals are focused on in their transformation programs can be really very different to what council and borough teams are focused on. And to a degree, that's going to be maintained. But then there will be some areas where we can actually combine our resources more effectively. So just onto the next slide. We have a delivery role. So one of the things that I think will be interesting over the next couple of years is that the borough partnership has sat above each of our different organisations. So it's been a sort of superstructure. And increasingly, I think we need to bring together our operational and our professional leaders who have local delivery responsibility, and we're really going to need to be focused on how do we get much more integrated delivery happening in our borough and be very sort of practical and driven about it. And then the last point to make with this section is that there is no change in legislation to the roles and responsibilities of the Health and Wellbeing Board, and no necessary change to the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. But one of the things that's interesting to think about is within an integrated care system, does that change? Is there potential for a more joined up approach to public scrutiny and accountability? If so, what would that look like? Just a sort of open question for reflection. The last slide that I'm going to talk about before we sort of pause and then we'll talk a bit more about the outcomes is this one, which is just a diagrammatic overview of how we work at the moment, where we've got the Borough Partnership Exec, and that is co-chaired by the Council Chief Exec, Andy Donald, and Helen Brown, who's the new Chief Exec of Whittington Health. And we report into the Health and Wellbeing Board, and we have a very small PMO. Underneath the exec, we've got Start Well, Live Well, Age Well and Place, and they're partnership boards. And they are often co-chaired by people who sit in different parts of our system. And they've each identified already, and we've got a kind of borough partnership plan. But each of the partnership groups has got its particular areas for focus. So for children, a couple of years ago when we set up the partnership board, lots of work went into what are the 3 things that are most interdependent between health and care in relation to children. And it was access to mental health services, speech, language and communication, and the autism pathway and reducing weights of autism diagnosis. And actually that's been really helpful because it's really means that every time we meet as a partnership board, we get update reports and people keep track of how we're doing, and they have been the right priority areas. Age Well, it has also been really effective with that. Just basically having oversight of the frailty pathway from prevention through to end of life care, and just brings all the partners together and regularly reviews how are we doing in relation to frailty. And there's obviously a lot of enabling work that needs to happen to get integration happening, and that's all the blue boxes, and I won't talk about them. I just want to mention place, because place is again, we've probably not got the naming right, but actually what the place board does is it looks across the borough partnership at a few really key aspects of our work. So one is health inequalities, and it particularly has oversight of quite a significant set of schemes that we've got that are all aiming to address the wider determinants of ill health. Our neighbourhood working, which is an integrated programme. So I think you might have heard before about the work we do in Northumberland Park, the work we're doing around integrated healthcare, health and care hubs. That is being taken forward by a joint team, and it has oversight of things like our outcomes framework and our enablers. So we have got a structure in place, and in many ways it works very well. But our question going forward is how do we refine this so that so that we can achieve both what's expected of us in the white paper and what we within our integrated care system define as being the role of place, particularly if we've got a bit more of an operational executive role, and we want to be really focused on knowing whether we're achieving improvements in health outcomes.
Thank you. A good place to pause for questions. So I'm going to look down at my colleagues. So Councillor, the Gurtsianis.
Yeah, just going back to so obviously co-production, co-delivery, that can mean a lot of different things. It's something that's sort of very basic as a simple presentation, just something much more complex, very more sort of fruitful. Do we have, what's the sort of SOP? Have we got that defined within this? Have we got a pathway through which we actually co-produce service, for example? Have we got examples? We were just discussing this beforehand. Have we got examples whereby you can share with us some examples of work in the past? If someone asked me to co-produce something, I wouldn't know how to say about it in terms of a wider service. Of course, it's not necessarily my job as a clinician, but that's something with a lot of complexity. There's a huge asymmetry of knowledge between, say, some health providers and patients in the wider community. Even this kind of thing, for example, is difficult enough for me or some of us to grasp, let alone a general member of the public.
It's really interesting. So one of the first things that when we got together and had a health and wellbeing board seminars, we said we need a schema for what co-production and co-design looks like, because you do it differently around an individual specific service like smoking cessation or a particular mental health service, compared to if you are engaging residents with identified priorities for their neighbourhoods. It's just it, and so we have got a scheme that Health Watch and the PMO put together, and is sort of could potentially be adopted by the borough partnership, but needs really to fit in, I think, with the council plans around co-production and co-design. So I won't say more about that. And I know Councillor does. But I just want to say that we do have some quite good examples of doing resident co-production and co-design, particularly around things like the neighbourhoods. So we are trying to kind of also do as we go along.
Yeah, I actually think that co-production for us in the council, we're really clear about what that is. And you're right, there are different kinds, in my mind, there are different kinds of engagement that we do, both in the council and in the NHS does, in my perception. But that's different forms of engagement. The way I would define, I think, and how we've set out as a local authority, as we define co-production, is as being where a service is designed for and with, and where we focus on what lived experience, people with lived experience tell us about what works and what doesn't, where their voice is brought forward with that aspiration, I think, of eventually having peers, people with lived experience, playing a role on boards, having a leadership role within the structures of a service. And I think in the council, we have some good examples of those, but that's not universal at all. So I think we can bring that to bear. And I was thinking particularly about some of, I've been to visit some of our alcohol services, and they are peer-led currently. We have people who over time have informed those services and now play a leadership role. And it's quite, it's quite amazing actually to see that. But those are long journeys. So think about that service, that piece of work started, you know, and Will can speak to it, it sits in that public health area. That journey started in 2014 for that service, so it gives you a sense of what that is. So undoubtedly, there's a long trajectory of how you do that, and it isn't always the case that co-production will work for a certain service, because there are for a certain, and I think it's really important that you're always really honest and upfront, and that's part of about what's on the table and what's not. And it might not work for every aspect of a service, but I think there is the scope to have lived experience at the table for many services. I think in the council, we're still working on how that might work. So in adults and health and some other parts of the council, we've got some really great examples and experience, and we're now working on bringing that to bear. And so what we've done, we've been talking in those conversations about our borough partnership. For us as the local authority, that's really important. We see it as both having better outcomes for people, but also part of our that deep understanding of our residents and that deep connection and collaboration with them. But I think a really important starting point as well, and it speaks to the health inequalities and inequity issue, is having a good understanding of who our residents are and who we're providing services for, and what works and what doesn't. And I think it's fair to say that across the borough, across the whole spectrum, not just the local authority, but within the NHS, is that always visible? Do we always know those things and know why? I don't think that's always the case. So I think that's an important starting point for us. So yes, I think we can set out some principles, and yes, it's a learning journey. And it's also, I think if we had some people with lived experience here, or who are peers who are leading, they would also talk about how iterative it is, how you learn, you do, and then you learn and you do. So it's not a to B and then there's a finished product. Now, how we fit that with some of the models within the NHS, I mean, I think those are good and challenging questions, but yet to see, like many things, how we do that. But I think for me, politically, I think it's really important that we set out and say that that's what our aspiration is, and to bring forward voices, because we know we'll get better services if we bring them, and that we go beyond the classic tick box and ask someone a question. That's not enough, I don't think. If we're going to really tackle some of those deep inequalities and deep inequities that we know are in our borough, we have to really hear. And I think, for instance, through the vaccine programme, we started to hear some of the things that people were really saying about what were barriers. We've tried to use that, but I don't know if Willie, you want to say more.
I think you said most of the things that I would say. There are some really strong and well-developed examples of co-production. There's a kind of ladder of co-production, and you almost have to work your way up that ladder from just talking about things, engaging, asking questions, consulting, to sort of involving service users more in the design of services, to get then sort of handing over even more power to service users. And in some areas we have done that. Vaccine program was interesting because we really went out into communities and listened to them. It wasn't really a co-produced service, but actually we were really listening, and that feedback has helped us with other health services. But the first question for me is, if we're talking about embedding co-design in the borough partnership, what does co-design look like in the context of someone or someone going to the general trying to get an appointment, and embed that around patients who are involved and start at the bottom of the ladder and work our way up. So yeah, I think it's quite difficult to produce a kind of one size fits all. So my view about principle that we can't get to the top straight away. We have to kind of work our way up for individual services. Some things will require a different approach than others, but with the background that we want to involve people in those conversations for the people services, we want to make them better. I mean, that's the core principle.
Like something else, I just wanted to say, I think also there's a really important point, which is there are some good structures around at the moment, but the real question is, do we have everyone we should have around the table? We had that conversation lots of times about the usual suspects. So the real challenge sometimes is breaking our own kind of mental model about who can or can't do something. And I think we've had some really good conversations within Cabinet about, and for me, I'm very passionate about the fact that co-production is also about investing in people. In that process, you've got a jug and someone brings all that knowledge within their jug and you chop that up and add to that. And with it, through the process of co-production, you enable them to answer more of the questions, know more, have more of the knowledge, and also you enable them to go out and be champions for what's going on in the community and some of the things that you want answers to, because they might not have answers. But I think sometimes we have some structures already where we engage, but we get the same people, and that there's nothing wrong with their input, but we're not having a full view, are we, of everything that they need to know.
Thank you. So listening to everything that's come up as a result of Councillor Kotsianis's question, issue question, it's been really interesting, but I wonder if the recommendation from us as a scrutiny committee is that we, because obviously this is in the stage of development that you're saying at the moment, that we understand we get some sort of document, whatever, around the principles of the co-design and co-production, and what you're saying around the different, the ladder around how that's going to be done. And I think Councillor Sness discussions around how we as a council also need to sort of think differently and sort of push ourselves as well to work alongside our health colleagues and voluntary sector organisations to do things differently. But I think at this point, whilst this is being put together and it's in the process of, and the governance structure's just been put in place and everything else, I think it would help us to see some document that unpicks or sort of sets out the principles, and as you said, a little bit gives a little bit more meat to the so I've got Councillor Peacock and then Beverly.
I just want to ask a basic question.
On this, on co-production.
It's about the boards.
Oh, we'll come to that next, Councillor Peacock. We'll finish the recommendation and then we'll come to your question. Sorry.
Thanks. I think a really useful conversation on co-production. I think the point I would make is that if we're really truly serious about co-producing, then we need to develop those principles with residents, with patients, with people. So I don't think it's for us as officers to actually develop those principles and then sort of say these are the principles.
Okay.
But
no, go on.
So, but there are some good examples that we can certainly share with you what has worked, because a lot of this is testing and learning. So, for example, the development planning process. That's a proper health and local authority initiative that has involved us working with people with lived experience in the co-design, co-producing the physical structure, but not just the physical structure, but focus on the outcomes that people with lived experience actually say that they want. So going back to the point, it's not one size fits all. We can certainly share with you narrative around what has worked there in terms of our approach to working with people with lived experiences. What are the principles that will come out of that paper? And some of them are really around, it doesn't begin and end with the development of a structure. It's that ongoing monitoring, review, evaluation, and how we work with people. So in a product, an outcome like that, we can certainly give you that narrative. But I think to say that we as officers should just.
So I'm going to challenge you.
You get
now.
what I'm saying?
I'm going to go back, Beverly, and challenge you even further now.
Sure,
Thank you.
fine.
No, that was really helpful, because actually, I take your point completely. So actually, how are we going to do that then? So you're saying that yes, we shouldn't be doing this as officers or as health professionals in that committee. And so the challenge is you're then going to be going out and engaging with residents and service users to set this up. So I think for us as a scrutiny committee, to understand how you're going to do that, what projects you're going to be doing it on, what, you know, where would your first sort of, you know, initiatives be in that. I think it's really exciting. So I think actually getting that rather than necessarily the examples, because I think we've had examples of good practice. I think actually what's more interesting for us as a scrutiny committee is to see how you're going to do that first stage, and actually how you're going to be sort of, you know, challenged as officers to do that in the process. And I've got your answer, and then I've got Councillor Brennan.
So I was going to say that I'm trying to emphasise the point that one size doesn't fit all, and we need to work with rather than do two.
Okay.
So there is just something around. Certainly, we could share the learning that has come out of the. What I can't say is that we can lift that learning and apply it to another project, because there may be different variations.
But I
in
think,
terms of.
I think there must be some sort of principles.
No, I agree
otherwise,
with you.
I
I
think
agree with you, and
yeah.
that's what I'm saying. We can share. It's very much a test and learn. We can share what's come out of the ways of working, for example. And campus is not the only project,
I know.
but I use that as a useful example because it involves both health, local authorities, sector, quality sector, etc. It's a really good example, and I'm very happy to, you know, develop that narrative about the approach, the learning. What I'm trying to say is we won't have gotten everything right in that activity. What we will come out with the learning, which will inform how we do other sort of initiatives. And I think it's very much an iterative process. And I suppose what we're inviting scrutiny to do is to work with us in terms of challenging, you know, how we are working with people, with residents, with patients, etc. So to really be involved with these active projects. But
no, I completely agree, Debbie. I think that because we've got co-production in the sort of the whole process, and finance will have some back to it, audit and risk will obviously have some back. I think it's understanding what co-production actually means, and I think we've done projects, and some of them have been done, as you said, you know, we've worked very well with our residents, etc. And the learning from that is incredibly helpful. But I think it's for us as a scrutiny committee to understand how that is then going to be sort of taken at sort of at the top level, because we all know, and I think Councillor Nurse has sort of said in previous conversations around the importance of taking staff and just making sure that everyone's trained up in the right way of you know, if someone's get used to Councillor Yanis was saying, he wouldn't necessarily know how to co-produce something with a patient, you know, he's a clinician. So how does that work? How do our staff get trained? How does that sort of get embedded? I think it's going right back to that. And I completely take your point, Beverly, around working with residents. I'm not saying we should be doing anything that's sort of exclusive. What I'm just saying is it's really helpful for us as a scrutiny committee to understand that really sort of that level of push and that level of sort of training up all our staff and in those areas so that they can work with our residents, to engage with them, to co-design with them. And I think it's just understanding from a health perspective as well, because we've understood a bit more in the council, to be fair, but now we're working jointly with our health colleagues in more ways. It's getting that sort of understanding from both, because there'll be different experiences and there'll be different complications.
yeah,
And I think it's that beginning understanding I think is helpful. But it's beginning. It's not a. It's just
and we're learning all the time.
Yes.
So certainly there's certain values that we can identify. There's certain principles that we can identify. One of our favourite phrases is relationships is the intervention. So there's something around the ability to build trust with residents, with patients, in order to get people involved, encourage people to be involved in the first place. So it doesn't just happen. And we know it doesn't just happen. So I think capturing the learning as we go along, we're not going to, you know, be talking about that. That it should be there.
Yeah, it's all
That we can obviously share with.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. So Councillor Councillor Brennan and then Councillor Peacock, you wanted to come on something separate, didn't you?
I was just going to say that, listening to what's been said, I think there's communication. I mean, the listening, right? Communication comes first. And I've found that just being new to the council, that I realise that there's a lot of communication that just simply doesn't happen from the council out. And part of the co-production, it's not just a case, and I think we should have forums, like physical forums when people can come and give their ideas, but it's also they don't know what the council's doing. They don't know, and people can say, oh, at this, loads of people have said, oh, there's a really good thing we do. How come nobody knows? I mean, I wasn't the councillor 2 months ago, so I'm a normal person. How come I don't know any of the good things? So it's something wrong with the communication, and that co-production works into that, because you can't properly input if we don't know what's going on. I think communication there's got to be a change. That's what I'd like to see, a huge change when suddenly everybody knows. And a little bit, I also think that because the council works, we speak, or the council speaks a little bit in sort of council speak, and it doesn't work for normal people. And when you say something, you say a buzz phrase, and then you explain it. Well, I understand the explanation. I didn't understand the buzz phrase. And the council tends to, and also they put up posters and they've got the buzz phrase words on them. It doesn't work. You've got to talk, speak, just communicate. That's why I want speaking forums where normal people are not forced, but then you've got to come along and say, loads of them where they can come along and say what they think.
Absolutely.
So, so that you're probably.
In fact, earlier today, we were having this conversation with Councillor just there, so I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm really glad that you said what you said, because it supports the dialogue that we're having. Later on, we'll come to an update about Canning Crescent, and I went today, and we've actually produced a sort of online digital little newsletter. And I said, well, this is brilliant, because even if I don't read all the words, I get a sense of what's happening. And I said, actually, an aspiration might be that by the end of 4 years, we might have something like this that reflects every service, everything that we're doing, so that people can, because you're right. Actually, every day, I feel really passionate about this, every day, hundreds of people get support in Haringey, and there are loads of challenges and there are loads of things we get wrong, absolutely. But there are loads of good things that are happening and we don't talk about them. And you're right, people don't know of them. And then they write and say, why are you spending 60% of the budget on social care? And, there are lots of really good reasons why we're doing that. But they don't know about those amazing things we're doing. So we're totally agreeing with you. I think we absolutely need to speak more simply and clearly, but it's not talking down. It's just not using strange language that you're right, that doesn't really mean anything to people. And we have to be there more present all the time, telling people what's going on, and in ways that they're interested in hearing. And I think my only challenge about the forums is, and I know this isn't what you mean, I think it's absolutely fine having fora where people can come, but my feedback also from people is they don't want to go to meetings and not have outcomes. So they want to know that, which is why co-production is a good model, because it's you set out and you say, these are the challenges we face. You ask people, how do you think we can deal with this? And then you come out and you come up with some actual outcomes. And then you invite some of those people to say, okay, now, do you want to follow and assess us? Do you want to follow that journey and see how we do on that, and tell us how we can improve continuously? Because otherwise it's just we've all been in those meetings. I mean, we were all, before we were anything else, angry residents, and we've all been in meetings where we just kind of said what was bothering us.
Well,
I've got to close that.
My meeting that Brooke has been to a couple of times and spoken to. I never had less than 100 people at the meeting. And when COVID first struck, that's what Will came along and spoke to them about it all. And so that's how it goes out. And I do monthly newsletters to people. And I buy my own chocolate, but I've got 350 members who get the information. I'm doing it all the time. Every single day that I'm breathing, I'm doing it all the time.
So, and I'm due to come on time. Last time I couldn't make it. There was another meeting in my day, but I'm due to go and actually talk a bit, but listen a bit as well. I think.
Can I just say we are running a bit short.
Sorry, we've gone down a whole rabbit hole here.
No, Councillor Peacock, just before you come in and keep looking at all, but Councillor Brennan, I've made a very good point around the comms and engagement side, and I think that's something that we're all really keen on. So I would ask maybe as a recommendation that on the next new project that you're going to be doing as a joint partnership project or something that's obviously suitable, that we get to see how the comms and engagement process is actually thought as part of that process and how it then works. And then maybe we do a little bit of work on that and whether people, the normal people in the street, do actually then understand what's going on. And I'll leave that up to you also to come up with a suitable project to sort of for that Scrutiny to have a look at. I think that'd be fine. Councillor Peacock, you've been very patient.
Yes, okay.
Please.
I was just going to ask a question about the boards. Who actually, I didn't know who the chairs are, but who are the rest of the people? And are there any co-optees on there? How often do they meet? And who do they report back to?
Some of that information is, there's a
The
government
next slide.
slide 15, which sets out who are the members of each of the partnership groups. We have the screen and the title is governance.
It's 65. Are you on 65 or no, that's
66.
66.
Yeah.
And
Well, it was a spaghetti mix of acronyms there. That's not a criticism, just it's
No, true.
by nature.
That doesn't answer my question. I mean, it doesn't answer my question. I want to know where the people come from who will be sitting on the boards and how any co-optees on it. When many years ago, when I started up the Harringay over 50s, at that time we had committee structure and we wanted to have a pensioner on every committee so that they could hear the voices of ordinary people who deal with the Harringay Council in one form or another every day of their lives. And I would be interested in having certain people on these committees.
Yeah.
And I'd like to know, where you're going to get them from. How often is their commitment to go to the committee, to the meetings? When will they be held? What sort of things? And I need to know. And lots of my pensioners don't do computers.
Yeah.
If they have a smartphone, they don't do emails on the smartphone or anything like that. They're basic people. They want it to language that understand and participate in, and you're going to get a good outcome from it all.
Rachel, sorry, just to sort of think on the Live Well one, you've got one that's a resident patient representative, but I couldn't see one on the others. So are they going to be? Are they going to be?
We do have a representative, I think, of the Harringay over 50s on age well.
Harringay over 50s have only got 50 members. I've got 350 members. I started off the Harringay over 50s. I started it off and it had a different format to what it's got now. And James Cowling is trying to resurrect it, but he hasn't got many members and they don't meet very often. And it's very small meetings they have. And our group, Tottenham Wood Green Pension Action Group, we were starting up when Margaret Thatcher refused to do the link between pensions and earnings.
Yeah. How did you miss this?
We've been going since 1982. We're celebrating our 40th year this year.
And another thing is, are these meetings held in public at all? So, right, okay.
Except for that, so the Health and Wellbeing Board
Right.
Is the others are not meetings in public.
Right, so it's just a representative. So she is Councillor Peacock's question about if somebody did want to sit on one of these, who do they get in touch with? Is there a position that they could sit on, or are there any other?
I think in general people would be delighted to have resident representatives on the groups. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it'd be fair to say those groups are all slightly different because they kind of emerge from a bottom up. Like, how do we get work done? And they're very focused on delivery of work and getting the right people to those who are. It's mainly kind of people in the health and care sector. So that's how they've emerged. There's not a kind of, they're not in a formal kind of committee structure. So it's always something that they could be kind of reviewed and looked at on an ongoing basis. They're different as well. They're slightly different, and so the Live Well board focuses on a small range of priorities. The Age Well really focused on frailty and the interface with hospitals and hospital discharge. So they're all slightly different in focus, and we might come on to that when we talk about kind of the outcomes that we're trying to achieve as well. So they're very much set up to deliver a set of outcomes.
So I think one of the questions going forward, when your next section is if there are any sort of voluntary or, you know, people that want to volunteer at Council Peacock, are there any other groups? If you could just sort of hold that.
A lot of my pensioners are ex-nurses, you know, they've been working in the health system all their lives, and they've got lots of things to share.
Yeah. So I think something will be the first step is just to give your group some information about what that group does, because and then how would your group feed into that? Because there might be something about sitting on the board, but it might just be best to think, well, how do we link with that group? So
To speak to people.
Because I want people talking to each other and not talking to that.
I know that's what I mean. They can get to speak to you as the large group. Okay, so we'll hold that as the thought. So
I just wanted to recommend also to committee, because it's something that I'd like to do. I'd like to do a bit more of. We have Health and Wellbeing Board, and Health and Wellbeing Board is a meeting in public, and anyone can come, and we take deputations, and we take and people can attend, and we take and I thought this. I've been thinking about this, thinking, well, people don't come, and they can, and it'd be a really great forum for people to share the experiences. I think a little more. And we've talked a little bit also about what we need to look at health and wellbeing. So how does it work in this new structure? But yes, I'm quite disappointed that no one, you know, but so I'm raising it here in public now, you know, encourage people to come and raise issues, bring deputations, much like people do here, to hear and to JOSC and what have you. And I think it's an opportunity to have a bit more of a conversation about how people are experiencing services.
That's really helpful. Rachel, did you want to?
I just also wanted to say that we've got a resident and voluntary community sector group that meets in parallel to the Health and Wellbeing Board and discusses the same items that are on the Health and Wellbeing Board agenda. And then we have two people who are a point of continuity from that group on the Health and Wellbeing Board. And I find those conversations really helpful, because they quite often identify what the most pertinent issues are that are going to come out of the Health and Wellbeing Boards. And we also have, you know, patient engagement network.
But how did you get those two people? I mean, you've mentioned the Harringay over 50s, which is a small organisation, where there are lots of other organisations in the borough. If you haven't, is it because James is a very forward person, and so he promotes the organisation when he's trying to get it off the ground? I don't understand. I really don't understand. Why didn't you come to people like me and my group to find people to go and sit on your committees? I really don't understand.
So just to say that the Community Health Advisory Board, which is the group that meets in parallel to the Health and Wellbeing Board, I think it's got very open membership.
I've never seen an advertisement.
Communication is I think.
I've never seen people being asked.
The important thing to say is it's quite a wide group with a lot of different people on it. I think that's a fair point to say, well, have we recently set up, or some time ago, have we refreshed and said, are there other groups that want to, has it other groups who want to join?
And ask for people to put themselves forward. Why not do that?
Well, that's an action. Councillor Peacock is, thank you, Councillor Peacock. That's actually really helpful, because we're just saying about, we always talk to saying, you know, actually it's widening out, isn't it, and getting around to everybody, and opening up.
Yeah, I do think Councillor Destiner's point around the Health and Wellbeing Board and how, you know, there's, of course, it's a public meeting in the deputations, but one of the things that we need to think about as we go forward is how we get community representation into the Health and Wellbeing Board. So if we're talking about a particular topic, having the same people, if we're talking about private health, it's how we get the right people in that discussion, so we can hear those. So I think the model of having one of people representing the community is pretty challenging model, and we're always going to come across those challenges. So, but we, of course, we can
Can I just say something else we used to do? When I ran the
Councillor
Harrogate.
Peacock, we
is-
chat about this. Sorry, it's just.
That
a
is
bit
something
time.
they could actually do.
Oh, okay.
That we have done in the past with the health people. And we had tables with a person who took the notes on each table, and there were people sitting around the table. And there'd be
Yes.
about 12 tables, and then afterwards, after the discussion, then we had a big meeting at the city centre as was, and had a speaker on those particular topics. Why not resurrect that, bring it back, and it worked in the past, let's do it again.
I just wanted to say, I think some things that might help this conversation here is also some things that might come up at OSC, both about how we're formulating our model for co-production and also how we're formulating a new way and better way to communicate with residents. So I don't want to overstep the mark and start, because it's not right here and that's in the leaders portfolio. But I think that there's some useful things to take from today that maybe could go on to OSC and that conversation that might help. Certainly conversation about the principles of how we do it, who we involve, and how we could improve our outreach to different groups across Haringey.
So following Councillor Peacock's question, we've got two things to that. One is the action from including more people and putting that conversation out there. And how we do that and that engagement process will be obviously conveyed to OSC, but it came up here today. Over the scrutiny, and that's really helpful. But the second one is around the Health and Wellbeing Board and that other committee, and opening it up and engaging with a larger group of residents, which Councillor Peacock has already highlighted here today, but I'm sure there are many others as well. So it's just that refresh that Council just now to say about engaging wider with our communities. So we're going to move on to the next section. I think, Will, you're speaking to that.
Yeah, so Dominic, if you could just go back. So I'm going to be quite brief, actually. So I'm going to start talking about population health outcomes. So of course, the real reason why we want to work at kind of borough level together is to improve the health of our population and to make our services work as best as they can. I'm not going to kind of underemphasize the challenges that we face, actually. So since 2010, we've been facing real challenges in terms of the health of our population. And just the latest data before COVID, male life expectancy was starting to go down in Haringey, and life expectancy is going down in the poorest communities. So inequalities are wide. We hadn't seen this kind of overall position in London declining. And then, of course, COVID has driven down life expectancy a little bit. And we've got huge challenges in terms of the resourcing of the health and care sector. So we need to be sort of clear about that. So I'm kind of reflecting on COVID and some of the successes of how we work together on COVID. We talked about the vaccination program. It's the first time we were systematically looking at kind of population health outcomes, vaccination, how unwell people were getting from COVID. We were looking at data, we understood which communities were affected, how could we try and close the gap in things like COVID vaccination, but so we want to take that approach into the borough partnership. And from a public health point of view, it's absolutely crucial that we build our health and care system to reduce those health and care inequalities. And we really focus our efforts on those who need it most. So this is just kind of a look at how we're beginning to do that. So traditionally, when we talk about measuring health and care system performance, we'll be familiar with like A&E targets. How many people are waiting at A&E? How long are people waiting for cancer treatment? What's the waiting list for mental health treatments? Those things are really, really important. But actually, we also need to look at population health measures. And this is just an example of how we're doing this at North Central London level. So building a picture of how we're doing on some key issues across sort of start well, live well, age well. And there's a lot of detail on this slide, and it's not actually to go into the detail on this one. It shows that in Haringey, for live well, there's a particular, there's something around how well our employment rates are for people with mental illness or learning disability, which we're doing some work on. It may trigger us to do more. Across NCL, there's areas like immunisations, and that's across London, cancer screening. that have been starting to emerge from this process. Within all those areas, we then need to go into the level of detail. If we're going to focus on childhood immunisations, we need to understand which communities are affected and the kind of interventions that we need to put in. So that's just to give you a picture of trying to develop this system, getting used to this health data, and it'll be in questions at the end of scrutiny. I think it's so if we move on to the next slide. So as well as those broad population health outcomes, we also have a bit of a kind of bottom-up approach to identifying local priorities through the different boards, through our conversations with residents, as opposed to data. What we're looking to do is really, as well as looking broadly at North Central London at some of those key public health indicators, is to identify a small number of priorities, start well, live well, age well, that we're really going to focus on as a system. And we're in the process of beginning to do this. And these are some of the things that we've been working on previously. I think we want to refine this further. So let's just take start well, for example. Here they're kind of quite broad outcomes around ensure that, for example, ensure the first few years of every child's life will give them the long-term. But within that specifically, we've started things like speech and therapy. We've started to talk children and mental, just to give you an idea of how we're beginning to focus within the borough on things that we really require that sort of borough level focus and the partnership that we've talked about. And again, this is questions. If we actually might be a good time to move on to the questions, Dominic, at the end, because some of them we've kind of covered, and some of them we haven't talked so much about. So in terms of the second question, I think with that kind of data and information, and you've already, we wanted to kind of come here and think about, this is a developing process. We want scrutiny to play a role and support us in that process, and we want you to think about what information you might need to do, what areas you might want to focus. So these are the kind of questions that we came up with, and I think we've started to answer. So in light of the kind of, now we've gone through the whole pack, it'd be good to consider these questions and just focus on the next one. Yes,
Right, so I'm going to thank you. Well, that's really helpful. I'm going to look to my panel to see if there's any questions. Has it got to be honest?
Yeah, I mean, the dashboard and the outcomes framework is really clear and it's great. What would help me, my role, trying to scrutinize would be, is there already written, or you could add this on? Is there sort of, in a sense, a column with sort of live projects or policies that we've already got in place that are evolving? I mean, I could sort of latch on to a bit more concretely. For example, how are we so far? What are the projects that we've got in place in terms of addressing the suicide rates? And we could we'd be guided, therefore, in how to scrutinize it. But it's both very granular in the same, but also quite broad brush. And these are the second bit, the outcomes frameworks. So that bit in between.
So this is already new. So you'll be one of the first people sort of outside the people who work in it to see the developing outcomes framework. So we're just starting a process of kind of mapping out, particularly where we're not performing well. So we're red. So because there's so many, we're going to start with the ones where we're not doing as well. And we want to assure ourselves that we've got plans in place. So I know, for example, childhood immunisations problem, okay, is no exception. We have got plans in place and we're starting to embark on those plans, but we haven't kind of mapped those out, as you say. So that is something we could subsequent meeting once the outcome as well, with the fuller side out. And I think the challenge is that this is just one slide on Live Well. There are loads and loads of things. So we still have to prioritize within that. So there may be some where we say that we're kind of doing okay on this. So whereas others will.
And I think it's really helpful, so building up on that, and I completely get we're one of the first people to see it, so it's, I hope this is useful feedback, but so it's, as well as understanding the policies that are developing, I think it's understanding, well, what's the difference, because you were obviously doing a lot of this work already. You know, it's not like you've suddenly thought, oh, do you know what, we haven't done it, now we're going to, of course, you've all been doing all this before. And I think for us as a scrutiny committee, the question for us is, so what's different now? How is this new ICB approach, ICS approach, changing at a level that we can scrutinise, and at that borough partnership level? So, I mean, I think as we would sort of think about earlier is, and maybe for us as a scrutiny committee to see one of the policies that you will now change as a result of a new different partnership way of working together. Maybe you've got new resources, maybe you've got just different people involved, maybe you've got clinicians. I don't know what the change will be, but obviously there is going to be a change because, as Rachel said, there are different people now on the boards and on the different committees to look at how you're approaching this. So to sort of strengthen sort of Councillor Cortsianis's sort of ask as a recommendation from us is to have a policy potentially coming through, you know, at some point when it's appropriate, but to sort of indicate to us how that's different, what's different. And then really another question from us, from our perspective, is okay, so in this new way of working, we're obviously hoping it's going to improve outcomes for residents, but why is it going to, what's different, what's going to be that extra something that is now going to improve? Is it just, as I said, different people involved? Is it different finances that are coming in? You know, what's going to be different other than previously when we had the CCG? Because I know the CCG's worked incredibly hard, and I'm sure, you know, this all looks familiar, but obviously now you're working slightly differently. So how's that actually changing the process in that?
I think that's a really good. I think we talking about a specific example, maybe, or a specific area. One of the differences already at North Central London level is this outcomes framework. We didn't actually have that before in the CCG. It's a real focus on what they call population health. They got in London. It's not a formal committee, but there's population health. Also chaired by Mike. A lot of the chairing. And this has helped us to get to that point where we could say at North Central London, we want to focus on cancer screening. And then this is what it means at a local level. This is what it means as a neighbour. Of course, we've been doing work on cancer screening. But actually, it gives us a bit more of a systematic approach to it. And then there's the community angles as well. So we could take an example like that, where there's a sort of NCL component, a borough component, and bring back what it is.
Thank you, because I think the challenge for us as a scrutiny committee is always to scrutinise things that are needing to be scrutinised. So obviously we're not a noting committee, we're a scrutiny committee. So so having that dashboard at that granular level was really helpful, was really interesting for us. It's like, and you said there's a huge amount more. That was just one snapshot, one point. So I think when you're saying what else would scrutiny need, we have the chairs and the panels meetings where we have the finance, the performance data and the risk assessment to have some understanding of how this new data is sort of taken up amongst yourselves. I mean, it would be helpful for us to see so that we can have that conversation outside of this committee so that we know which areas with officers we can have that discussion and say, okay, so which areas are you particularly interested in? Are you going to be focusing in on? You can say, well, in 6 months we're going to be doing a policy on this, and we can go, right, actually that might be something the scrutiny would be really interested in. I think it's that heads up approach, I think, which is really helpful for us, the scrutiny committee, so that full knowledge really, and what you're basing it on. So that data, I think that granular data was, but in that performance risk and meeting would be really helpful. And there's one other question, recommendation I was going to suggest is around budget scrutiny. So we once tried to look at a sort of something that was coming through, because obviously with our CCG colleagues in the past, they obviously came with their own budgets to, it was when it was joint partnership work, and we were just beginning that process, and we were going to sort of jointly scrutinise on that. I'm just wondering around the budget, because obviously we all, in our panels, we all scrutinise our budgets. How is this joint partnership working going to change the budget? Because obviously we've got that council budget that we put in into adult social care, but obviously there'll be an NHS budget coming in to sort of for that joint partnership working. So it's understanding the finances behind that, and whether that finance is going to be substantially changing, you know, a different, you know, something that's going to be on your list of whatever you're going to be taking forward. But it's looking at that, and I think it's the clarity. We never really understood the clarity about what as adults and health scrutiny panel we could scrutinise within that budget. So so I think for us it's a in terms of reference around our budget scrutiny, really, in a new world that we are now going to be in with that joint partnership work, and when we've got pooled budgets, how do we as a scrutiny committee scrutinise that finance in a way that's appropriate, but also in a way that's useful for us? So that's a recommendation and a challenge back to yourselves, I'm afraid, to come up with how that's going to work in the future, so that we're not asking for something that's not appropriate or that is out of our remit, but we just need to understand what is within our remit and what we can scrutinise work. So I mean,
I'm smiling.
I like the fact that you're smiling,
because I recognise the challenge. I think we all recognise the challenge, and I think it's fair to say these are issues that are still being worked through. So, you know, the paper talks about devolving resources to place, by within that parenting. That has yet to be worked through what that actually means. So I think having scrutiny alongside scrutinising is only a good thing, but at present we're very at the very early stages of conversations around what will be devolved, and you know how we will work together. Is it aligned? Is it pooled? Is it, you know,
and I think and thank you, and I think having that as a point of clarification as you're going through that process, so that that's in the minds of whoever the finance director is, and I think, right, okay, so that bit will be, so we're not asking after the event when everyone's sort of thinking, just put it all together now, and we've got to unpick it and think what's, you know. So I think it's just having it at that, as you said, that very outset of that conversation, I think.
And I'm really glad that you've asked that, because I think I really want to know how that's going to work. Because we're going to look at how we think about in the borough partnership, what we think are priorities. And as I said before, the big question is how will that be funded? And I think at the very least, following it with you will give us the opportunity to have a certain transparency outside of that network that we're sitting within, to be transparent and say, okay, these are the priorities we've identified based on our population need, based on other themes, and this is what we're being provided with in order to deliver those. To be blunt, I think that's a really useful thing.
I think, as Beverly said, it's evolving. What is the kind of model of delegation? And I think the other thing that is evolving and developing, and really interesting to work through with scrutiny, is that having a joint budget doesn't mean that you are necessarily really using that joint budget to achieve outcomes. You can bring your budgets together, but unless you've got really robust, mature relationships between the people who are doing the kind of commissioning and between all the different partners, you don't inevitably get that really, really effective conversation about how do we deploy that joint budget really effectively. It takes a huge amount of work because it's such a lot of detail that sits behind it. And actually you need a structure that enables it, because otherwise what gives one manager the entitlement or the the right to challenge another manager on how they use their budget. So I think we do that relatively healthily in many ways, particularly our Better Care Fund, which is, you know, an example of a joint budget that we've had over a long time. But what I'm really interested in us being able to do through the borough partnership is to say, what are the areas where really effective joint management of budgets and joint oversight would allow us to better use our finite resource across the piece. And I think you can only do that in quite a limited number of areas, but you can try to do it. You can try to do it with quality and the sort of intention. So I think as we identify as borough partnership, what are those areas that we really want to focus on and really want to take shared look at our resources on? That might be something that we would sort of bring and want to do openly, but we haven't done that. We haven't got there yet.
Okay, so just to be really clear, what exactly did you just? Oh, sorry, that's really that very. Because I had the large picture, but I wasn't sure
So
what that meant in terms of scrutiny.
So I think that as the borough partnership evolves, we might pick a particular area. So just to give it a sort of hypothetical example, do we really want to improve care for children and families of children aged 0 to 5 who currently go to North Middlesex Hospital, so that we reduce the rates of attendances, because we know that's very high. So if you wanted to do that, then you would have to say, what are the budgets that you could, what are the budgets that currently do help to support families so that they have better information, better support, navigation, and also that we put into same-day access for basically sort of primary care type services. And how do we make best use of that? So North Middlesex employs people to work in ED, seeing paediatric cases. We have initiatives that are trying to do parent education and support. There are early years, there's children's centres. So you would say, right, well, let's look at all of those and let's see whether there is better use that we could make from some of our commissioning budgets of voluntary sector and it's very difficult because most of these things fund kind of people who we need fundamentally to be doing the jobs that they're doing. But you could have a look. You could have a look and have sort of joint accountability across our different agencies to help us to really sort of appreciatively inquire about how we're using our current resource and whether anything could make a difference. So that's just a hypothetical example.
I just want to come in and say, and please correct me if I get this wrong, but I think what you're really describing there, though, is that will test the system's relationships big time, because everybody's doing their own job. Everyone, I'm here with my part and I'm here with that. And the group, then everybody needs to come together and say, okay, let's suspend reality and say, imagine if we didn't do it like this, and instead, and I'll pluck out completely randomly and say, imagine if we don't do that and we invest because of what we know about those families. We invest in a project that's a piece of work engaging families for whom English is a first language, for whom there are multiple deprivation, in really engaging with getting access to GP and that early help. What if we do that and we say, not that means you there and you there and you there might not do what you do anymore. Instead, we might, and that's going to test the system. And the thing Rachel's saying is we might not do that everywhere, all over, because the system can't take it. And plus, some things do have to happen. But we might ask ourselves, what are the 3 or 4 places where we think we can make the biggest difference in doing something like that, and getting everyone to suspend what they normally think. And let's admit, people are really committed to what they normally think and normally do, because they, you know, there are reasons why they're doing it. It's not made up. There are reasons why people are in ED or whatever else it is. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think there's another bit to that. So I understand the complexities of that, and I think that was very well discussed by both Rachel and Ness. But I think for me also there is an understanding, I think from a councillor's perspective, because this new pooled budget, you know, from what we know of, when we were looking at sort of, you know, the money that comes down the system, we do usually understand that the NHS has a larger pool of larger pool of finances. I know it goes into deficit. So, and social care obviously has to keep within a, you know, it cannot overspend. And I think it's, and we know that often that social care budget, though is large, it's in comparison, it's a smaller pot than maybe coming in from health. I don't know, but I think from us as councillors, again, good to understand is how that is working, and if the 6 priorities that are chosen, and we look at them as a scrutiny committee, we go, well, this is all great, but it does all seem to be focused around hospitals. That's a bit interesting. So what's actually happened in the social care bit? How have we improved that bit in order to sort of work? And I'm sure this is going to be very well thought through, but I think from a scrutiny perspective, it's good for us to sort of scrutinise that and understand that part of the process as well, just to sort of see how those budgets are being spent. And, you know, not in that detail, but, you know, just as an overview on that. But as I said, if we could think about this now, when you're doing all the governance and the, you know, at this stage of the setting up the boards and setting up how this is all going to be reported and who it's going to be reported to, and you're asking us, what do you want the scrutiny committee to be, you know, asking at this stage? Well, this is all new. And I think that's a challenge that as a scrutiny committee that we would be putting that challenge out now. That could then be sort of thought about how that could be reported back to us in a way that's effective, useful, and enables us as councillors to understand the process and of course the finances that go that's involved in that.
You want to know who's spending what money where in Harringay.
Yeah, Chair. So thanks, Beverly.
Yeah,
And then we'll.
okay, that's really helpful. I think the only thing that I would add to that, it's not just about sort of, we're really looking at the wider term.
Yeah.
We have to look at resourcing for housing.
Yeah.
It's like employment skills. It's all of that.
I was going to say that, but I was thinking that might make you look even. Yes, no, you're right, actually, no, and that should be said at this point, so thank you. And that's it, so that's a slightly larger ask, but there you are, it's been made, so thank you. Okay, are there any other recommendations that or sort of questions or actions from the report that we've heard today?
So I mean, obviously, I've got, you know, there's a list of things in my head of specific, you know, issues or specific services that I'd be really interested to hear about. But then I think that falls within the, as we've said, the sort of more granular detail of all the sort of politics and
Recommendation on helping about getting what policy and working our way through and seeing how that actually works.
just to my understanding, will that be therefore by September? We would
So
try and
So we'll go back to officers after the meeting and ask when's a good time to, because they'll also need to look at their work and see what's coming. We need to utilise. Yes, thank you. It's good to challenge on the time frame. Yes.
I've got a really general, it's not quite, well, it's a sort of query, maybe not relevant totally, but this ICS, they're sort of the same throughout the country, aren't they? Everybody's got an ICS, yeah? So when we're talking about, when Pippa's talking in terms of what benefits is the ICS going to bring, blah, blah, blah. But this actual concept hasn't come from you, it's actually come from somebody else and been imposed on you. But that's my sort of interpretation. But you have the total freedom to interpret it or to make it work. And what we're talking about is how you're making something that's been imposed on you, a sort of structure that's been imposed on you, how you're interpreting what you've been told that you have to do, sort of thing.
So ICSs, as in regions, have fairly fixed expectations of what they have to do. So they have to balance the budget, they have to come up with an outcome framework. They are accountable for health performance and quality. So that is fairly fixed. What's much more subject to local negotiation is what's the role of place and borough. And obviously around the country, it's not necessarily, we don't not everywhere has a neat coterminosity between a council boundary and a sort of health geography. So there's complexity. And so they've been national policy has been much less prescriptive about what is the role of place and how does place relate to your integrated care system. So that's why we're having to work that through as we go along. In that respect.
Right. I think it's a huge challenge, but it's quite exciting. It just sounds really positive the way you're managing to sort of like meet this massive challenge. It seems a massive challenge to just have somebody told now you have to do things this way. It just sounds quite positive the way you're interpreting it.
We're really lucky in Haringey, but because we have been working on this sort of well for quite a long time, so it hasn't come and told us anything that we need to do that we hadn't already been wanting to do already. In a way, we've got a bit more ambition than sort of we could probably go further faster, but you have to do that within a framework and get consistency across different boroughs. But thanks for that. It's not, I feel like it's been positive.
The watchword is resources, isn't it? That's the challenge.
Yeah,
You know, that's the big challenge.
Anyway, on that positive note, thank you very much, and thank you for coming along. That was really helpful for us as a committee to understand what's happening with the new structure, and I think we've made a few recommendations. Dominic will compile those, get those to you, so you can see what we've suggested from the committee tonight. Thank you very much for your time, and I do appreciate it. Thank you. But, yeah. We're going to go on to cabinet member questions now. So we've got councillors next with item 10 for questions. So councillors knows we're running a tad over time. So I've been asked to use
So I'm adding, sorry, so just like to interrupt to say I'm adding Jill Taylor to the meeting.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you. So yes, so if you could sort of say what you're going to say, but maybe shortly each paragraph.
Yes, I'm gonna slice it by into a third. How about that?
Thank you.
You don't want me to waffle on to ask you. So I'm going to say two things. I'm just going to set out some identified priorities that we have, some priorities that we have identified for the portfolio area. And then I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the context and some of the things that are on my mind and worrying me, and probably some of the team. So we had set out a few priorities when I became cabinet member in 2021, May 2021, and we've retained some of those and added a few others, and hopefully it'll be really obvious what they are. And I would have talked to them a bit more, and I might maybe get an opportunity later to talk about updates for Canning Crescent, what's up in that. But so mental health and wellbeing is one. Migrants and refugees is another. Violence against women and girls. Our health inequalities and inequality and inequity, and that lens for generally for looking at the work that we're doing is really important. Locality working, so having what we put in our manifesto, and the important thing to say about these priorities is they align very closely with the manifesto as a commitment or more within our manifesto. So locality working, what we mean by that is the 15-minute neighbourhood and our role within adults and health within that. And a bit further, what that means is having within our communities a presence, which means that people find a service locally to them rather than having to truck across different parts of the planet, and that they've got somewhere they can go, because we know that that's what people want and need somewhere. And it may be we're starting small and we have a bit of a trial on that that we'll be working on in Northumberland Park, and that's about, in that case at the moment there are staff already working 1 or 2 days a week in a place, and we're beginning to think about that. And that will very much be about partnership as well. So it'll be about how we come together, and there may be social care and other community service. There might be community safety, there will be health in a place together at different times and different places in the borough. And then finally, as you've heard a lot about our work in partnership together and borough partnership. So, and I just think it's about adults and health working well together, and us working well as a council with our NHS partners to try and make the best, as you put it, for something that's been imposed on us. And so those are key priorities. There's a hell of a lot of other things that happen within the portfolio. And personally, I've picked up on, there's been a few, there are a few challenges for us around impact of COVID and demand. So we've seen challenges, and we've been brought before and been very open about challenges within the aids and adaptation service and within transitions. We've been really open about that, and I think we'll come back to you again and seeing improvements, and also thinking differently about how we do things within that and how we work together, and also making that connection between housing and social care really important within that too, because we know that maybe we could improve and make difference to people, feel differently a little bit about how we're accommodating people with particular needs and for their lifetime as well. And then I said I'd talk about some of the context. Everybody thinks that COVID's gone away, even though I think we're in the middle of we are in the middle of a wave, but there is a sense in which perhaps some things have gone away, or some parts of COVID have gone away, but actually we still feel the impact quite deeply within our services, the backlogs that were created, the issues that they haven't gone away. And we have a key challenge around complexity of needs, seeing people having much more complex needs. And I don't think I'm betraying any confidences by saying we recently had some data through from one of our health partners around the possibility that in Haringey we have maybe 20 or 30% more people in our borough with 2 or 3 or more long-term conditions. That has huge implications for us, because that means that we will see a lot of complex needs within there, and it also means a hell of a lot if that person falls ill and goes into hospital, both in what we call deconditioning and in how they may go in walking, to be blunt, and continent, and after a period long stay and with their other conditions, they may come out not able to walk and perhaps incontinent. And these are cases we're dealing with all the time, and having to perhaps historically seeing people get on their feet more quickly, perhaps in our re-ablement service within 8 weeks. Now we might be seeing someone at 14, 15 weeks, not quite ready to go home in the way that it would be. So I think that provides us with significant pressure and challenges us. But we like a challenge, and we're willing and to think differently. And I know that the team are working on how we both work closely with our NHS colleagues, but particularly think about how we can, it's a bit of a reflection of that, working together, how we can perhaps address some of those challenges with the NHS. That's really short.
Thank you.
Little
that was a very
whistle
tour of yes, a huge amount that's actually going on in the service. And I'm sure we're going to draw some of the details. So I'm going to start with Councillor P, then yes, you get first dibs. Is there a question you'd like to ask? Okay, Councillor Gutzians.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge subject, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned refugees, and refugee health is one of the priorities for the council. I've been very involved, before being a councillor, but as a health worker and as a trade unionist, I'm very involved in terms of the hostile environment that unfortunately is now has seeped into the NHS when it comes to migrant access to healthcare. So, as you know, undocumented migrants, members of the Windrush generation, indeed, have all been impacted by these new sort of charging policies that came in a few years ago. And I've seen specific examples, actually, not only on sort of political level, but in my day-to-day practice at the North Middlesex and other North London hospitals. This isn't specific to North Middlesex, but I've seen concrete examples there in the last few years where patients are actively discriminated against when it comes to sort of accessing life-saving care, such as, for example, being on dialysis, okay, being a replacement therapy. So I think that's something really important. We've heard some of these cases in the media over the last few years regarding investigation, but to be honest, that's the tip of the iceberg. What could we do as a councillor, or you as a cabinet member, just to sort of try and bring that issue forward? You may well be already doing lots on that specifically.
Thank you for asking that question. Actually, in my portfolio, just general migrants, refugees, sits within the portfolio, so more broadly than just health. So that's quite helpful because we can have a more holistic view. I think you're right. There are big challenges and the real challenges with no recourse to public funds. And we have some work, we've got Jill on the call, we have some work already taking place around access, especially to primary care, knowing that that's one of the big barriers and then takes you further later on in a condition. But what we have in Haringey is we have something called the Welcome Advisory Board, and that brings together representatives across the voluntary sector who are working with refugees and migrants in the borough. And we've used it quite tactically, it's fair to say, to help us learn, grow and develop a way to respond to recent events like Afghanistan, like Ukraine. But there's a real desire for us to be, and I'll bring Jill in as well, to be quite strategic and work with the board and the people around the table, those organisations, including Haringey Welcome, etc. Want us to be quite strategic, think really clearly, have we got an offer in our borough that works for everyone? How do we make sure that people know about it and access it? How do we make sure that everyone is accessing what they do have a right to, because that's an issue. And actually we've committed also to looking and auditing some of what we do to assess the impact for refugees and migrants. And I've been really reflecting on the fact that sorry for those who've heard me say this already, we thought that 50,000 people would apply for settled status in the borough, that's EU citizens, and actually 100,000 did. And so that could be a third of our population. And if you were to extrapolate a bit more about other populations, you'd see that refugee and migrant issues are issues for a very large proportion of our population, both first, second, third generation. And the things that they have experienced, the trauma, the health challenges, the challenges with finding work, etc., all really relevant to a lot of people. So it puts that piece of work around what's our offer and how we can audit what we do, as it gives it a certain frame and a certain pertinence to a lot of people in the borough. So Welcome Board is a focus for that work. And actually, our next meeting, we're going to talk about that. Maybe Jill can say a bit about that. That offer and what's on the table for everybody and making sure that it's experienced equally, but also a little bit about the audit. And then at the following meeting, we're going to talk specifically about health and what the issues are there. But Jill, I don't know if you want to.
Hello, thank you, Councillor Dasnes. Maybe I'll give just a few kind of practical examples of work that we're doing in this space. There's a lot to say, and so forgive me for being as brief as I can. One of the things I think is really important and really valuable to note is that as a London Borough, we are definitely considered one of the best in terms of the work that we're doing around supporting people with no recourse to public funds and other immigration issues. And that's something which has been led by cabinet members and by councillors for a good few years here. That has led to us doing things that other boroughs haven't done. So, for example, we have the most rent-free beds available for people with no recourse to public funds who are homeless, certainly anywhere in London, but we think possibly in the country, which is really helpful in terms of health in that it enables us to support people who might have been in hospital for emergency care, and we're able to support them into the community and provide wraparound support. So that's something which has really made a huge difference to the health inequalities for a small number of people at the moment. As Councillor Dasmes mentioned, the Welcome Board and the Welcome Strategy are something which has kind of been evolving a lot over the time since the strategy was developed. At first, it was, I think, fair to say, a fairly strategic strategy. And what we want to look at now is what are the things we can actually deliver as part of that? What is the offer that we want to be able to give to our residents who are affected by immigration status? Or also, what do we get in terms of the relationship and what residents have to offer us? It's not always about us understanding our residents in deficit, but actually how do we celebrate and strengthen the cultures and the communities that have been developed by our migrant communities over the last several decades. We're also at the moment looking into our offer, for example, around support for Ukrainian refugees, but also the Afghan relocation scheme. And this week, we've also just received confirmation that we've got a small pot of money to support the Hong Kong migrants who are moving into the country at the moment. So there's a lot of different projects that are taking place. And what we want to hopefully get to is a place where we feel we have a broad strategic understanding and an offer for residents that we can explain to them and that is tangible, that they understand what that means, that they will be able to access from us. And I guess from the other perspective, thinking about how do we also campaign on their behalf so that we're using the levers available to us to access funding where it's available, but also to think about the statements that we want to make about how we support our communities, as Councillor Dasnev said, bearing in mind that that actually is the majority of Haringey. So there's lots of different things happening, and I think hopefully we'll be able to bring back a bigger picture of all of that work when we've done some more work with the Welcome Board. So hopefully that's enough of an overview for now, but I'm happy to answer any questions about specifics if that's useful.
Thanks, Jill. And I just wanted to say, I think it's a well-pointed placed question because the Borders Bill means we will see more hostile environment. One of the things I've sought to do is I'm really conscious that us as a borough, we have certain values, but it will become more and more difficult to live those values. So I've connected with the Joint Council, the Welfare of Migrants, and they've got a councillor champions network. And what that is a really useful space for us to start to talk about what we can do within the confines of the law that will help us resist some of those nefarious policies that are within the Borders Bill. I think that's beginning, and there's a whole dialogue within, for the first time I think, with councillors as well around how we can do that and support one another. And I think it'd be particularly important in London. So there was some conversation about perhaps a London network even.
So can I just check your bits of your questions around healthcare in hospitals? Is that something that we have any sort of discussion with our health colleagues around? Because I think that was one of your.
Yeah, I mean, do we have, in a sense, so part of the issue is in hospitals, and as I say across London, is that the way they interpret the legislation. Now, I think the legislation is designed to be somewhat ambiguous so that there's a certain clause of deniability on the part of government when it comes to actually quite basic assumptions of the legislation itself. But actually, the way that some trusts interpret it makes it even more clearly and systemically racist. I'm wondering, do we as councillors or as a council have some kind of, whether political or more practical, kind of oversight role where we would hold a trust to account some way?
I think that's a good question. I think it's tricky because that you're really in the subtleties, aren't you, of how you interpret the law. I think it's perhaps an interesting topic for Health and Wellbeing Board, actually.
Jill, sorry.
Just to say that, so across NCL, we have a group of colleagues that meet from both councils and from the CCG who are looking at inclusion health, of which migrant groups are part of that population. At the moment, we haven't got into, I think, the detail of the legal issues like that. But what we are looking at is how do we expand capacity to support those people who will be marginalised both inside and outside of hospital. I think when it comes to the focus of that at the moment, it's often been on people who don't have anywhere to go when they're leaving hospital, as opposed to a broader population of migrant communities. But I think that's a really useful thing for us to pick up as part of that. So thank you, Councillor, we can do that.
My suggestion is basically just the data collection, in a sense, auditing, asking the finance departments of the various trusts, and then you'll get some answers potentially.
Very useful, thank you.
I think that the integrated care partnership wants that it would be interesting if the inclusion health group could feed into that, which would give it visibility across all councils, and could be something where expectations were set out, whether or not you trust the sovereign organisations, but there could be framework.
So just to be clear, from a Scrutiny perspective on following this up, what's the best way to sort of capture those sort of the queries that have been put forward? But obviously, you're right in this process at the moment, Jill. So what's a good way of us getting information back from yourself that's pertinent? And
I think possibly the first step is to do as the councillor suggests, which is perhaps to ask for some of that information. At the moment, we haven't asked that kind of question of our trust colleagues, so that would be a really useful starting point. And then perhaps to follow Rachel's suggestion, thinking about how we take that into some of the ICS development conversations. So perhaps it's getting the data first and then seeing what that tells us and going from there. I'm happy to take that as an action.
thank you. So the action from this would be that So we do that, we get the information back, and then we'll discuss it as a panel about where on the work programme we want to potentially look at this, depending on what's found out and further conversations, further information. So thank you. So Councillor Peacock, you have a question, and then Councillor Brennan, I'll ask you if you want to.
Yeah. Mine's on a slightly different topic. Because many years ago I was involved with, we set up a group for violence against women called Hearthstone. And I don't know what happened to that because I was down in Commerce Road and the shop is no longer there. And I'm very interested in that. But also, I've been dealing with cases over the past few years of violence against men. And you don't seem to touch on that at all. And that actually does happen. And with thanks to COVID, it's happening more often. So I'm just, asking you, is it going to be extended to men? And if not, I can see Jenny, you're taking it, quite all about it.
My Hearthstone pen.
Remember, we set it up with Councillor Newwood Camber.
That's such a good question. You'll be really pleased to hear. I was down at Commerce Road just having a wander around, happens to be in my ward today, and I bumped into Margaret, who is an officer in Hearthstone. So it's very much there, and Denise can say a little bit more. And I think it's a good question. You're right. There is a focus on women. That's because primarily perpetrators tend to be men, and people experiencing it. Domestic abuse tend to be women, but you are quite right, it does happen, and there has been a bit of an increase, so I think it'd be an interesting dialogue to have around that.
So Hearthstone's moved from the shop front into the community centre just behind. So during COVID, we couldn't socially distance within that building, so we took the view that we'd move. So we are in the community centre just behind Commerce Road, and also we're co-located with Food Box, for example, so there is more of a sort of mix of services that we can kind of pull together at a point when people are in crisis. So Hearthstone continues, it's grown slightly, which is good. We've got some new burdens money because of the Domestic Abuse Act that came in, so we're looking to extend our offer to be a bit more outreach to people, as well as having the core service. Hearthstone does offer a service to men. So, yeah, I mean, it's quite difficult to attract people to the service. So we do try and do some quite specific work around that, but it's a service for men and women.
Just a little bit of an anecdote, you don't mind.
I
I was out in the bank last week and I met this man and he said to me, "Do you remember me?" I said, "No." He said, "You dealt with my case 14 years ago when you were head teacher at the school. He was being beaten by his wife, and I eventually helped him to get custody of his daughter, and he showed me photographs of his daughter, who's now graduated and has got children, and they're all very happy." So that was something I've done in the past, and that's why I'm really keen to help men as well. And men seems to be under the counter, nobody talks about the men, they only talk about the women. And as I said, because of COVID, a lot of men are also getting that.
And that's a really good example of why really good community advocacy is so important as such. So thank you. And I want to just take the opportunity to say that we're investing, as Denise says, a lot more money into our VOG services. What that means is having more focus on young people, on older women, and also a bit more focus on perpetrators, and perhaps doing a bit more kind of that campaigning. That's one of the things that community's been talking a lot more about wanting us to be really visibly out there campaigning and holding perpetrators to account. There's a lot of good work happening with the police. Yes, we do.
In the borough, or do we take them out of the borough?
We have both.
So Jill can talk about the refuges. So we have refuge provision in borough, but actually a lot of women go out of borough to get away from the situation. So it's a kind of how it works. It's worked on. What was it? Oh, the police. So Councillor Desnes mentioned the police. So we're doing a lot of partnership work with the police around how they support is mainly women, how they improve their pathways and their just the interactions that the police have with women and girls in the borough to build trust, as well as building capacity services as well.
Jill, did you want to add anything? Or what is that?
Maybe just to briefly touch on two things. One is a lot of the men that come forward as survivors of domestic abuse are themselves victims of violence from men. So we've also commissioned, or we're just in the process of commissioning, an LGBT specialist IDFA between public health and my service to support some of that need. And also in recognition of some of the changes in demand that we've seen since the Domestic Abuse Act has come into force. Denise and I are also, and with partners in property and capital projects, working on the development of Burgoyne Road, where Hearthstone will come in and deliver some services, which will be not a refuge, but we describe it as safe accommodation under the new legislation, which means that we're able to offer residents more choice about whether or not they do want to leave the borough. And certainly for those women who are experiencing violence, which they don't and we don't assess to be a risk to their life, we want to make sure that people can remain in their communities, and that what the work that we do centres on is supporting that to happen in partnership with police colleagues, community safety, and also neighbours. And a really nice thing that's happened at Burgoyne Road is that we haven't kept the service a secret. At the moment, it's not solely for domestic abuse survivors, it's for women who are also who are homeless. But what's been really wonderful is the way that the community have kind of moved around the service. They're going in there and doing running clubs and jewellery making and really nice activities that are really bridging that gap, I guess, between marginalised women and the neighbourhoods that they're living in. So that's been a really positive development and part of a co-production process for that service.
That was really helpful to get that sort of level of detail as well. That's good to hear. Councillor Brennan. I'm going to ask one quick question, just because of time for the last night. I'm going to ask if we could just have a written update, possibly on the Canning Crescent, the Irish Centre, and Osborne Grove, as just 3 areas. Sorry, rather than, is that okay, panel? Otherwise, yeah.
Actually, we've got a really nice newsletter that's just been produced on Canning Crescent. Gives a good overview of everything that's happening there. But just to say, we're hoping for the autumn. It has been delayed. It's quite principally around building delays and materials, that side of things. But I was there today, and it's looking good. We've got a really special way that we've chosen, but you can read that in the material, how we've chosen to name it, etc. So some really positive things there.
And come back on that. You just mentioned the Irish Centre.
No, just Canning Crescent.
The Irish Centre, because at the last meeting, or at a meeting I had with Charlotte Pomeroy, she was supposed to report it back, but she never did. And I sent her a letter now, an email to Andy Donald, because I'm really concerned about the Irish Centre and what is happening there, because I was vice chair of that for many years. And I know that building inside and out, and I'm really concerned about it. I'm hearing rumours that other people are using the building without our knowledge.
Oh, okay. I did not know that. I hadn't heard that.
Yeah.
So mine was going to be about the Irish Centre and the Grace Centre moving in. But yes, okay. So that was it.
Get a written update, and
Yes.
and also we could catch up as well if there are those concerns. It would be allay your fears, etc. And pick up where those are coming, where that's coming from.
Did you want to come in?
I was just going to say that I've got a brief update that I can share now, but if it would be better to give a longer one in writing, then perhaps I can do that instead.
I think just for sort of time, and then it gives us an opportunity to come back with further questions if we've got anything. Otherwise, I can see that will be a long night in itself. So a very quick question, although this probably isn't very quick. Obviously, budgets. We know that there's going to be a potential that I don't know what the divvying up of the budget is, but potentially looking to £20 million savings this coming year. We know that adults and health. When I say overspend, I say that with the understanding that there was a need for the overspend because of obviously COVID and there was a huge amount of pressure on the service. But that was, I think, 7.7 million, wasn't it, at the end of the financial year. So it's just really about the budget going forward. And I'm happy to take this as a written answer. But it's just really an understanding about, with all the pressures that we know that adults is going to be under, and all the different sort of different service provision, how realistic is it for savings within services that are currently stretched at the moment? So that question, and I'll take that as a written answer. So if you want to give me something brief, otherwise I'm happy to, that's.
Yeah.
That's something really.
Yeah, dear written. But just really important to emphasise that we invested an extra 6 million this year, as you know, and it's challenging, and we are spending more or less 60% of the cash for the right statutory and moral reasons, I think.
It is complicated, so yes, but I thought I would ask that at the beginning, at the very first. But thank you very much. So that's all for the cabinet member questions. Thank you very much for coming along today. I'm sorry we didn't quite as long to ask you, but there's some updates.
I missed about 5 pages of notes there, but never mind, another time.
I was going to say, I'm sure, but thank you very much everyone for coming along. For the panel, obviously we've got the word program particularly those do not need, we haven't finished yet. So we move on to the final item for tonight, the agenda item 11, which is the work program update. So this is the opportunity for us to have a look at what we've got coming up on the work program and if there's anything specifically we want to add. It's 69. Oh, yes. It's at the end anyway. Last table on the back.
Thank you.
It's just an opportunity for some people to ask questions now. So we want to sort of ask some questions. So we obviously we've had the July meeting. We've got the September meeting, and just to let you know, on the 9th of September, and I'm going to look to Dominic to confirm the Scrutiny Cafe is happening on that Friday, isn't it?
That's right, yeah.
Venue yet?
I have to check with Rob and I'll have to circulate an update to everybody, but the invites are due to go out early August, I believe. But they're the invites to the wide stakeholder group, typically about 3 or 4 weeks before the event. So that's.
Centre, or was it the?
I know the sixth form centre, sixth form was looked at as an option, but I'm not sure. So I've not been involved in that directly, but I'll find out.
Thank you, Dominic. That'd be great. So on the 15th of September, which is our actual meeting, we've got the Living Through Lockdown reports. Now, for those of you who haven't been with us, that's the Joint Partnership Board reports that Councillor Peacock will know. So the Joint Partnership Board is obviously, they meet at the Wingfield Centre, and there's various groups. I don't know if you've been. No, I've been there. So there's various different. Yeah, excellent. So there are various different groups. So Helena, who's one of our co-optees, but is a joint chair. And there's lots of different groups that form this joint partnership board. So it's a really useful way for us to sort of interact with lots of different groups within our communities. Now they produce Living Through Lockdown reports. Now, if you haven't got the hard copy, it's worth maybe Dominic seeing if we can get hold of some and distributing to members. It's an excellent report. We've been taking it over a number of years now because they made loads of recommendations. And we've been following up those recommendations and just to ensure, to scrutinise that process and to see what the outcomes were from that. It's an adaptations one is on the 15th of September. That's around the delays and the supply of dues. Just to let you know, we're looking at not only getting an officer report, but also, we are getting an officer report. We're also looking to ask residents who've had experiences with delays around aids and adaptations to come to the scrutiny committee and sort of have them as expert witnesses. So they're not coming to provide a deputation. They're not doing their 3 minutes, but they're sitting at the table alongside us and are part and parcel of that conversation, that scrutiny around aids and adaptations. Is getting that sort of people with the experience of that in the room is obviously quite helpful when we're trying to sort of talk about how that service is going and what new thoughts are around any new provision.
Will a cabinet member be here?
So not the cabinet member, aids and adaptations will be on whoever is, I don't know who's going to be heading up the report. Dominic, do we know?
I'm afraid. We're having our agenda planning meeting next week, though, so we'll get the detail of that.
I think details. Yes, many councillors have told me over many years about this, so this is,
So I'm wondering if we could have the cabinet member, because it really needs to be highlighted.
okay, I can speak to councillor Dusnets, there's a request for the cabinet member to be part of the aids and adaptation. Feedback. So, and the final one we've got is the finance and performance update. Sorry, and just so you know, so I'm sorry, I realised that you probably were not as aware that the chairs of each scrutiny panel, and we can invite the panel along too, which I always do. We have a quarterly update on the finance, the risks, and the performance data. So that gives us a better understanding of what the concerns are. So once I was talking today about getting data into that committee, into that meeting, that gives us a much better understanding of where the areas of concern are for us as councillors. Because we've also got our residents who come to us. We ourselves have got experience, but also seeing the data and actually understanding what's in the red, and that's obviously really useful. So the finance and performance update is on the 15th of September. We're currently getting the full meetings going to be put through into the diary, because obviously we need heads of services, and obviously that's just an informal meeting, but it does give us that background into that. So that's just, I'll get dates for that to let you know. Then on the 17th of November, we've got the Harrogate Safeguarding Adult Board Annual Report, which is really good for us to understand how safeguarding is going on in Harrogate. Dominic, I'm just wondering, we've got CQC overview, which we used to take alongside the Harrogate Safeguarding Adults Board. Is there a request for this CQC report to be taken later, rather than alongside the Harrogate Safeguarding Board?
That was the arrangement last year, so I think that's why it's been penciled in that way. But we can check. I said we've got the agenda planning meeting on Tuesday next week, so we can ask about that.
CQC one is good because we've got the external, CQC coming in and sort of giving us an update on what's happening in our care, and then we've got the safeguarding. So it's quite good to have both of those agenda items together. And then on the 8th of December, we've got budget scrutiny. So we've got ones at the bottom, which is around transitions, monitoring of progress, the transition between children and adult services. We've got issues that were raised last time, which Peacock's been saying about the opportunities around dementia.
They're closer to dementia centres than exactly the borough. They're both in my ward.
So we've got the Haynes left in the west, but we haven't got any specialist dementia services as far as I'm aware in the east. So that's
we did that.
Yes, but that's a challenge for us. So sometimes, on scrutiny, we've been following this up around dementia provision, because obviously that's a rising concern. And then we've got the community mental health model and suicide prevention. So those are sort of. Is there anything from tonight that you have also, because we may potentially be getting something back from the conversations we've had tonight, scrutiny we've had tonight, which then might be an agenda item, maybe on refugees, or so they're sort of, we want to keep 1 or 2 spaces empty in case we get data that we think we need to follow up.
Well, I know from my experiences, a lot I rise dementia now. Well, I see it amongst my pensioners.
Yes.
Yeah.
So dementia is something you would be interested in having on the, okay, what about others?
The building has been empty ever since they vacated it.
I mean, it just prompting a thought on what you said in terms of it'd be nice to have it, because that's quite interesting. I wasn't aware of the fact that we didn't have these dementia services in these, but we do in the west, or we did, but we don't any longer. Do we have a list of services that we have in the east versus the west? That would be interesting. And I'm just thinking of a subject that I'm fairly interested in, just for various reasons, both in terms of circumstance, but also politically. Autism services, for example, is there discrepancy between east and west?
I think
Or
there's
is it
the other way
I mean-
around. I've been told by people who live in Muswell Hill that all the services are in the
Yeah, no,
east,
that's
east of the,
interesting.
east of the borough,
That's not-
and that they have
But
to
is
travel.
that, yes, yeah, is that true?
The Warrior Centre is the new autism centre for provision, so that's sort of slightly more east,
Sure,
but you know,
sure.
that's the new autism hub and the new autism and learning disability provision. That used to be in
I have on it in my school.
the Haven, so that used to be where the Haven used to be. So that's there. So Dominic, is it possible to ask officers for a list of service provision, so specialists around, was it dementia services?
Yeah, no, it's
Just
yeah, in general, so obviously it's
Cancer
not necessarily about a pure geography, I suppose, so sure, you know, the autism,
We
like,
can-
you know, it might be in one area, but it's
Autism
whether.
classes. I had one in my school, and there was one in Belmont. And I think one in
They're
Risbon.
still in Belmont.
Yeah.
Well, we can ask for it to be mapped, couldn't we? So we could, you know,
I don't know if we've seen anything like that in previous presentations, there might have been, but certainly not.
yeah, we could ask and I get them to circulate it to the panel, so then you'd have a really good idea of what we've currently got, because to be honest, there was quite a bit of change, so actually it's probably quite good to get an updated on
The
anything.
other thing I'm sort of interested in, I think, going forward again, is whether it's an agenda item or not, is as borough, how we sort of in terms of our resilience going forward for sort of this pandemic era, basically. I think, as you know, in a sense, we've officially kind of come to the close of the COVID pandemic, but actually, you know, we've got increases on from within hospitals. We're doing more work than we've ever done as infectious disease doctors, for example, as other clinicians. And, you know, going forward, even non-health service stuff, you know, things like everything from, in a sense, I think it would come within our remit, whereby we can reach out to other parts of the council, you know, I'm talking about, you know, ventilation within psychiatric hospitals, for example. There's been a load of intra-hospital transmission within psych units around the country. How are we doing from that point of view? For example, when it comes to sort of, you know, the access to gyms. I'm just talking about sort of how can we as a borough be ready for the next sort of pandemic? And by the next pandemic, I mean future Omicron variants, etc. And I mean beyond that. Monkeypox is a huge, there's putting a huge pressure right now on sexual health services. Again, that falls within our remit, but there's no extra funding for that. You know, just pulling that, the idea, you know, in a sense, to use the government slogan, you know, living with COVID or living with pandemics. Are we good? How are we doing? What have we learned from this one?
Yeah, and also I think, Councillor Nurse was saying about the number of people that have now got multiple, you know, comorbidities or, you know, sort of issues that have arisen because of either COVID or, you know, they were ill anyway and they got COVID and now have much.
Yeah.
And the stress on the rehabilitation service, as she was saying, it was 6 weeks and now it could be 15 weeks. So I think maybe there's a whole item around actually, you know, what have we learned from the pandemic? So what we got in place so that we're resilient, and what are the new services that we are now thinking we're going to have to fund in order to support the residents who have now on COVID or other issues from COVID.
Yeah.
So I think that would probably gather all that. Dominic, is that sort of that being, we could put that in as an agenda item. So I'm looking at the agenda, so I'm just literally. Right, so if we looked at putting that in possibly November. So we potentially have the Haringey Safeguarding Head of Board, the CQC and the COVID update, which is a bland way of saying everything that we've just sort of, and we can speak to officers around the feasibility of getting that as a substantive report by November. I'm sure, you know, public health in particular are on it, you know, but it's good for us to know. And actually that's very sensible for us as a scrutiny committee to scrutinise.
I wanted to, is there a possibility we could put in an extra meeting?
We can do an extraordinary meeting if there's, so I was going to come to that at the end. So what we've done but what we've done in the past is, as I said before, we've had a joint children's and adults meeting in sort of February time. And that's around transition, so young people going through usually mental health support with learning disabilities. It's around the whole transition. So I was going to speak with Councillor Guinness, because we initially said, oh yes, we must do that. We haven't put a date in the diary. So actually I'm going to ask officers, Dominic, can you coordinate and ask if we can get a date in the diary for February with the joint children's and adults, and it's around, and it'll be looking at that, those young people in transition, particular issues they have around getting into work, sustainability in work, learning disabilities, autism, and mental health. And I think Kathy, you were saying about the issues around mental health and the wider concerns around getting parents and who is part of that process. I think is.
I'm a governor of 2 schools, and there's an uprise of children with special needs.
Right, okay, so actually if those are the numbers coming through, then actually that transition cohort needs to, that service needs to be aware that this is the future planning.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll put in a request for that to happen in February, so that would be good. Is there anything else we want to put on? Because we've got, is there anything else you want, or do you want to hold, because the budget is December, that's it, so the only one we've got left is spaces in March, so do you want to hold off?
Yeah, let's see what comes and what comes out.
Yeah, exactly. So what from the ICS update today, I think it'd be really sensible to hold, because I think what we've asked for very clearly is examples of not only the co-production and how they're beginning to go about that process, but also how they're going to look at specific areas, policies, and how that's going to change as a result of that joint partnership working. And we wanted to see how that really, and I think, so Dominic, can we pencil that in for the March meeting? Because I think that might give them enough time, hopefully, to come up with something that's useful for us as a scrutiny committee to look at. And then we'll hold 2 open places in the March meeting. We probably won't have another cabinet member question because we've already had one this of this period. So we usually have 1. I don't know if I put it into one.
We have 2, it's typical for 2 per year for each panel. Yeah, I think we have done 2 per year. But yeah, but it's penciled in for March, but obviously it can be moved around if we want to.
Okay, so we'll put that on as an agenda item for today's ICS briefing we had for the March. And that, is there any other questions? Dominic?
Just going to ask about the scrutiny reviews. I don't know if you had a discussion about that in the informal meeting recently, or whether it's decided to wait for the scrutiny cafe first, or.
So it's good to wait for the scrutiny cafe, obviously, to see if there's something very specific, but it's also useful for us to hear from you as panel members. Obviously, we need to also discuss with our co-optees and other panel members that aren't here, but is there anything at the moment that you're thinking actually a year's project? Well, actually, it's 6 months in reality, but is there something you're particularly, have you got any areas that particularly wanting to look at, deep dive into?
Only the one I spoke about.
So that was, we're going to do a European scrutiny committee, so that's going to be discussed on Monday. So if I give you an update on after the Monday European scrutiny committee, and then you can understand what we're doing there, and then if that.
Yeah.
But that's we'll put that on the list.
Yeah.
And then that's a good point.
To hold that thought and just a cap the cascade.
Cap on the 9th.
Then, yeah, well.
So, but as I said, please do think about it in the next month or so. And just think, because you're suddenly hearing, suddenly you're getting loads of residents coming to you going, oh, this. Actually, that's a good point. So, okay. In which case, thank you very much, everyone, and let's close the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Yeah, very much.
It's,